Alright, in this video I want to review a book, Stalin, Volume 2, Waiting for Hitler, 1929 to 1941 by Stephen Kotkin. And some of you may remember I reviewed the first part of this biography probably 2 years ago. Kotkin's a pretty well-respected, pretty good researcher and historian of the Soviet period, and he's in the process of writing a 3-volume biography of Stalin. This is, like I mentioned, the second volume. First volume covers his basically his birth, a little bit about his childhood and early upbringing, the start of his revolutionary career and his prison sentences, the revolution, World War I, and then even more importantly, kind of his rise to dictatorship, and then his collectivization of agriculture in the 1930s. In the late 20s, 25, 26, 27. This book covers the least amount of time, probably, of the entire biography. Obviously, he hasn't written the third volume yet, but this ends in 41, and he dies in 53, so we're going to get a 12 years. Yeah, so it's about the same. So this basically covers the 30s, and covers the lead up to World War II and also the Great Terror. So one thing, it's a cliche and a justified one that the Soviet Union was a horrible despotism and that it would committed mass murder on a previously unforeseen scale that's only been matched by the Chinese communists and then nearly matched by Hitler. Although there's enormous dispute about the actual numbers. There's no question that it ranks in the highest rung here, probably second only to the Chinese. And it depends how you want to count the deaths. Now this book, the previous book on the collectivization of agriculture covers much of the famine, so the Holodomor, the famine in Ukraine, and there were certainly political purges and killings in the USSR prior to Stalin. Lenin was not a pacifist by any stretch. He wasn't a peaceful Marxist. He imposed his will on the masses quite ruthlessly, but not at the scale and not with the capriciousness that Stalin did. This book covers where Stalin starts to pass from merely a dictator to a despot, to somebody with unrivaled power. There's a difference between being the most powerful person, somebody who has most of the functions of government under their control, to somebody who has no near rival, nobody who can even really oppose them, at least with any decent hope of success. I think there's always the one chance in a million that somebody could just kill you, but if somebody were to actually plot your demise, what are the odds, right? And if you have a pluralistic society where there's multiple power centers, you might have the most powerful single person, but some of the other actors in that society are strong enough that they would have a plausible chance, maybe even a high likelihood of success. You have in Stalin's Russia or in Hitler's Germany cases where this is not true, that nobody would have a very high probability of success. Not a zero probability. Hitler was almost killed on numerous occasions. One thing distinct between him and Stalin, as far as we know, very few people even really attempted to kill Stalin. The degree of his control was such that very few people even dared to attempt it. And this book kind of, in a way, juxtaposes Stalin with Hitler, and it's even in the title, Waiting for Hitler, and points out that in some ways Stalin's despotism went far, far beyond anything that Hitler ever even attempted. The way that he treated people was far more mendacious and petty than the way Hitler tended to. Hitler, for his many faults and for his many failings, did have a certain degree of honor. He had a certain degree of respect for other people. There were other people that he looked on as worthy in some way or another. He had loyalty to a point. In fact, sometimes to a pretty great point. So juxtapose, when Hitler took power, there was resistance to his regime in various elements of the government, whether it was in the Wehrmacht, or which he renamed the Wehrmacht, but in the military, in the chancellery, wherever. And he didn't. Yes, there's the famous example of the Night of the Long Knives and Ernst Room in the essay, but other than that, he didn't purge people like literally. He fired them. Like the generals that disagreed with him, that weren't big on rearmament or on going on a course that could potentially lead to another world war. He didn't kill them. He just made them retire and actually gave them really generous pensions. And many of them survived through World War II. They weren't later rounded up and killed, at least most of them. And he certainly didn't attack the Nazi Party, again, with the exception of the SA, which was a distinct organization. And even then, I think the number of SA assassinations, if you count Room and the others, something like 400, 300, 400, something like that. So yes, bloodthirsty. You know, the, Hitler is deserving of the odium that he currently has, even before World War II, just for that reason alone. But that does not compare uh, quantitatively or qualitatively, you could argue, with anything that Stalin did. So Kotkin makes a point of emphasizing contemporary sources over later sources. So there's lots of people who, after Stalin died, or 20 or 30 years later, would say, "Oh, when he was a child, you could tell that he was evil because he, was cruel to a dog or whatever, or his father beat him." Kotkin basically puts very little stock in stories that are retroactively sold. This is after Stalin's become powerful, after he has a reputation, and then people either make up stories or invent in their mind stories about him. He tries to base his research on, to the extent possible, contemporary resources. So somebody at the time, say when Stalin was a child, writing, well, so and so Saakashvili acts this way, and go off of that. Uh, which isn't to say that later reminiscences are necessarily wrong, but they get colored by the way human memories always get colored. In addition to the fact that there's also political motivations, so he really tries to emphasize. So he looks, in terms of Stalin being a despot, his friends, people who knew him well, his secretaries, party loyalists, people he had, he under Lenin, he wasn't the necessarily the most powerful person. He wasn't necessarily the most famous Marxist. After Lenin, Trotsky was probably the most famous if we're talking about in the Civil War and its immediate aftermath. Um, but Lenin apparently put a great deal of faith in him. There's a lot of dispute here because of the so-called Testament of Lenin, and in the first book, Kotkin goes into great detail about the veracity of the Testament of Lenin. So supposedly, Lenin dictated a testament where he said that Stalin should be removed of power. However, this was brought forward by Krupskaya, who is Lenin's wife, but the documentation for it is not great. Usually at that point in Lenin's life, all his notations were double annotated. There were scribes, there were doctors who kept track of everything, and the provenance of this particular declaration by Lenin is disputable. However, Stalin based his legitimacy as being, quote, Lenin's pupil. The worldview, the zeitgeist of the Soviet Union as it was being cultivated, he presented himself as being legitimate because he was Lenin's greatest pupil. Lenin had too many other peers at the time, people like Trotsky, other military leaders, and Stalin really couldn't distinguish himself from them, but he could say, I'm a better student. And so this claim that Lenin had repudiated him, it basically never went away. You still see it. You can still find YouTubers today who will kind of distance Stalin from Marxism and Marxist-Leninism and communism and say, well, here's why, because of this testament, this last testament of Lenin, which, again, it might be true, it might not be true. The documentation for it is less than convincing, but not necessarily completely wrong. So, but that's basically a tangent. The point is that Lenin did put Stalin in a position of great power as being general secretary of the party. That's not actually a member of the government, but because the party was running the government, the person who was running the party had enormous influence. And Stalin began building his dictatorship even before Lenin died. Lenin had a series of strokes. He became largely, if not completely, incapacitated, and Stalin started, building up his dictatorship by gaining influence with various people, turning one person against another, uh, and taking over the various party organs and then the various state organs. Um, but his friends, the other people in the party, were aware of this. There was a kind of a clandestine meeting between Krupskaya and a few of the other early communists. I want to say Kaganovich, maybe one or two others, and they basically said Stalin's amassing all this power, but he's a good communist, he's a good Leninist, he's got the will to do what's necessary, so it's probably okay. None of them were necessarily in the position to overthrow him at that point, but their conclusion was that he probably doesn't deserve to be overthrown. Um, People didn't think of him as psychotic or needlessly cruel. Obviously, these are Marxists. They believe in completely pitiless persecution of their class enemies, however defined, and so he would be excused for doing all sorts of barbaric, bloodthirsty, uh, uh, unforgivably heinous acts just by virtue of being a Marxist-Leninist, but they didn't think he went too far. Now later, in the 30s, that's when you start to get people, especially in the later 30s, you start to get people saying, wow, there's something wrong. So Stalin launches into collectivization of agriculture. This is in the first volume of the book, and just a very quick rundown of that. Um, Almost all the land in Russia and the Soviet Union was de facto owned by peasants. There had been this kind of revolution along with the Marxist revolution. There was a parallel they didn't have serfs, but agricultural revolution where landlordism and the last vestiges of feudalism were kind of done away with, and the peasants kind of appropriated the land that they had probably already been working on. Um, and although Lenin made some early steps to try and force the collectivization of agriculture, they quickly gave up. There was significant resistance to this in the early 20s. Uh, Bureaucrats sent from Moscow to go and organize the collectivization of agriculture were murdered by the thousands. I think the number given was 6,000 of them met their deaths at the hands of unruly peasants. And ultimately, to alleviate the food shortage, food food shortage, and kind of throw up their hands, not necessarily in surrender, but in at least armistice, Lenin instituted the new economic policy where they basically codified the private ownership of land as far as farmers went. They still nationalized heavy industry, but they allowed privatization of the land. But this was not something that was within Marxist-Leninist theory as a long term. Leninism's one of its main tenets was that you can make short-term alliances, you can make deals and treaties for strategic reasons all day. This is why making a treaty with Germany was okay. It's fine in the short run. You can repudiate it later. If you need to make an alliance with a class enemy, that's fine. Just along the road, you're going to have to repudiate that. So Stalin comes to power. His dictatorship is now complete. And everything's fine, and then he decides he wants to collectivize agriculture, where 1% of the farms were collective, 99% of them weren't. That's literally the stat that he gives in the book. And basically everyone in the Politburo, everybody in the party was against it. They said this is going to be disastrous. We don't have the necessary control to do this. There will be resistance. This will disrupt food production, which will harm our industrial plans. Bear in mind that the Soviet Union was sacrificing consumer goods, consumer well-being, by exporting not just a surplus, but a greater than a surplus of their agricultural production in order to finance, the acquisition of capital, equipment, and technical expertise from the West. A process, by the way, very, very detailedly described in Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development by Anthony C. Sutton, quite an iconoclastic book for anyone interested in that. And Stalin said, I don't care. Uh, this is what Marxist-Leninism demands. There's nothing in Marxist-Leninism that says that we can have private agriculture, that it needs to be collectivized. That's straight from Marx. And he went ahead with it. And the point of the book, the second book, is that this very much actually weakened his dictatorship. The disruptions that this caused to the society and to the economy and to the politics of the Soviet Union were so deep that they could not but endanger his own power, and he knew that, and he did it anyway because, as I titled the original video, Stalin was a true communist. He was a true believer, and he thought this will get us to a utopian society, and so even if there's a high risk, even if it's going to be difficult, even if there'll be bloodshed and mass death, which indeed there was, it was worth doing. He comes through that successful. Now he has, successful in the sense that there's no longer private agriculture and now everything is collectivized. Not successful in the sense of making it a worker's paradise or a good place to live or anything along those lines. But now he has the credibility to say, I'm the only one who had the force of will to do this. All the other people of the party, the vanguard, these are people who are supposed to be the vanguard, who are supposed to be leading the way to socialism and communism. They don't have the balls to do it, and I do. So then in the 30s, he launches, and we don't know why, he launches a purge, not of class enemies, not of kulaks, not of former white officers or of priests or of spies, but of communists. The Great Terror is a persecution of communists. The numbers he gives is around 1.5 million, maybe 2 million. Not all of them communists, but most of them communists, at least half. So disproportionately a huge emphasis on communists, because the Communist Party, though large, was never a large proportion of the population, probably 1 or 2%, something like that. He eliminates all of the leadership except for Molotov and Voroshilov, who, Molotov, he imprisons his wife, executes his secretary's wife. Voroshilov lost a lot of power, and all the other ones, Ganovich, they either committed suicide or they were killed. And he could be absolute. This was set off by the murder of Kirov. Now, I'd always heard Kirov and Stalin were great friends, that Kirov was indeed one of Stalin's few close friends, and it's been alleged in most of the documentaries I've seen that Stalin probably had Kirov murdered, and that he was then used that as a pretext to purge the party. As far as Kotkin's concerned, this is extremely unlikely. That there's pretty good documentary evidence that Kirov was actually murdered by a disgruntled party member. With to understand, in this party state was just an absolutely abysmal existence. If you the only way to get ahead in life was through the ingratiation of the party and of some party boss, somebody of a higher rank than you who had the ability to give you a position and then to patronize you. And if you in any way got on the outs with, not necessarily Stalin, because how many people could know Stalin, but anyone in the ladder above you, you were basically screwed for life. And Kirov was murdered by a guy who basically had fucked up once and basically was kind of frozen out of the system. He was still technically a party member, but was no longer given advancement or opportunities for advancement. And he was really stressed out. He had a family, and he killed Kirov. And that's not to preclude the possibility of an assassination by Stalin, but Kotkin says the evidence is against that. That from the best we can tell, that this was just a revenge killing against, a nominally guilty, a figurehead of the party who was obstructing the advancement of this one assassin. So the purge didn't happen immediately. It happened in waves, and there was just an attempt to find people who were associated with this guy, and then people who were associated with them, and then people who were associated with them, and then of course they used torture. And I think it was Lavrentiy Beria has said later, after Stalin died, that torture is not a good way to get evidence, because people who are being tortured will say anything, and then you cannot tell what are they saying that is true and what are they saying because they just will say anything because they're under torture. It is a great way to get confessions, though. There's no question that torture is a great way to get people to confess and then to implicate others. either press them to specify people, say, hey, name X, Y, and Z, or say, name someone, and then those people would end up in the same position, more than likely. Um, there were a few people who actually refused to name anyone. So you have some grudging respect that some of these guys had their eyes ripped out and never named any other people. So there were some, principled in their own way, tough motherfuckers who resisted, but that was probably not one person in 1,000. Uh, and most implicated whoever they were told to implicate, plus however many more. And then those people, that implication was a death sentence, essentially. There's one episode where somebody approaches Stalin and even suggests, hey, these people are being tortured, so their confessions really don't mean anything. And Stalin replied, they're dead anyway. They know that we're going to kill them, whether they confess or not. So the fact that they confess really is evidence of their guilt, because they know that we're going to execute them regardless of their confession. So they have to know that their confession won't do them any good. Now, it seems unlikely that the interrogators and torturers were telling that to the potential victims, and even if they had, torture will make you say things anyway, even if you know you're going to get killed. You might as well just get killed sooner anyway. So, uh, he was he could be unbelievably mendacious. So there's one mendacious. There was a point where, one of his top lieutenants shows up at his apartment, and the NKVD is going through all of his stuff, ransacking the place. And while they're there, just as he's walked in, the phone rings, and it's Stalin. And Stalin's like, "Hey, is everything all right? Are you doing okay?" And the guy's like, "No, I'm getting interrogated by the NKVD. They're going through all my stuff." And this is like an old friend, an old comrade of Stalin, and he'll be like, "Can you tell them to leave? That I'm good. Can't you vouch for me?" He goes, "Oh, I can't." He goes, "I don't have any control over that. It's not. I'm just the party secretary. I don't control. If the NKVD has investigations they have to do, that's none of my business. I hope that you didn't do anything wrong. You should be okay if you didn't do anything wrong, right?" So clearly, like a cat with a mouse, taking pleasure in doing that. There'd be no other reason to do it. And then you had this got so out of hand that it actually was. Well, in one of the if you go on YouTube, you can find a lot of interviews with Kotkin. And if you don't want to read the book, or you just want something to spend some time, just look him up. And there's lots of interviews of him or presentations of him talking about the books, both this version and the second. And it's pretty common for somebody in the audience to be somewhat sympathetic to Stalin and to the Soviet Union, and will ask something along the lines of, yes, he did all these terrible things, but the Soviet Union won World War II, so doesn't that prove that he was right, that the industrialization of the Soviet Union was achieved, and that Stalin should get credit for this, and that while his methods may be unsavory, they produced results? And Kotkin's reply, and there's a lot you could say to that, was, you don't modernize by murdering millions of people, especially your most technically capable people. So the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s had a relatively advanced military. They really had a revolutionary advantage in the sense that they were able to discard the social constraints on most other militaries and say, what's the most effective thing? They had this big scientific socialism. What's scientific? And so there were all kinds of innovations in the use of paratroopers and the use of tanks. Soviet Union had more tanks at the start of World War II than all the other nations in the world put together. Granted, most of them were not very good tanks, with one notable exception, and that was an American tank, but let's not quibble too much about that. But Stalin purged 300,000, 400,000 officers from the military, the most advanced, the most skilled, the most capable, and you had a situation then where guys who had been mere majors or colonels were becoming generals because everyone else had been liquidated. This did not make the Soviet Union more capable of resisting fascism. Quite the opposite. He goes into details about the foreign intelligence, the spy rings of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union had tremendous capacity when it came to spying on other countries because of the ideological affinity so many people, especially in Europe, had for communism. There were lots of highly placed spies throughout Europe, the United States, in the UK, in Germany, all over. He relates a story of when Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union. He had a high-level meeting with his top lieutenants, 5 or 6 people, and outlined the goals of the campaign, when it was to take place, and how it was to be run. Stalin had a breakdown of the entire memorandum on his desk within 5 days. So there's little doubt it wasn't like these top lieutenants were necessarily spies, but somebody on one of their staffs was, because this information got to Stalin before it got to most of the German high-ranking military. Right before the Wehrmacht was making plans, Stalin had the memorandum on his desk, or a summary of it. Right, it wasn't a photocopy of it; it was somebody who had seen it, who had reproduced accurately its contents and gotten that. So their intelligence gathering capabilities were astounding. They had guys, Cambridge students from the UK, who were communist, and they joined MI6. So they're the top of like counterintelligence in the UK, and they're sending everything that they have to the Soviets, all through World War II. All right, so uh, very famously, there was one of the German part of the German legation in Tokyo was I forget his name. He's famous Soviet spy, and so he had all this information about the Japanese. Well, because of this purge, two things were happening. Spies who knew things or who were very capable were getting liquidated, were getting murdered, were getting destroyed, and then others were basically, who, if they were smart, ran away and disappeared, and some of them defected. And there were some very high-level defections of intelligence officers to Japan, to Germany, who said, "I don't want to die, and let me escape, and I'll tell you what you need to know." So there's absolutely no question that what he did hurt the Soviet Union in terms of its military capabilities, and there's actually really good evidence that Stalin himself was aware of that. So there's a case he relates in the book, rather interesting one, where Stalin isn't interrogating somebody in the sense that it's in an interrogation chamber, but he's talking to an official, and he's saying, isn't it possible that the overzealousness of the NKVD, he wouldn't blame himself, is harming our, the 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 cause of socialism by weakening the armed forces and weakening the intelligence agencies. And of course, this guy, you can't criticize what's going on because that's a death sentence. And so, even though Stalin was coaching him to say that this was a problem, the guy refused. He wouldn't. He would say, "No, everything's fine." You had to say everything was fine, because if you spoke up, and there were people who would voice and say, "Hey, this is counterproductive. This is wrong." I mean, they had moral questions, they had utilitarian questions, both very legitimate. And not only would that get you killed, it wouldn't change anything. No, Stalin would not listen. He would not take that advice. Anyone between you and Stalin, they wouldn't do the same. Everyone, even the most powerful person next to Stalin, was terrified of getting, and that terror paralyzed them. So this kind of reaches its climax, and the book basically ends on the night of on the early morning, 4 a.m., 3 a.m. of June 22nd, 1941, which those of you most know, that's the day that Germany invaded. Um, you know, the Soviet Union was getting all kinds of intelligence that this was going to happen. Like I said, they had a memo of the plan to do so almost within a week of the being official policy. But yet they were not prepared for the invasion when it came. And part of the reason is that even people who knew were afraid to say anything. It did come to Stalin's ears. He was aware of the troop buildup. He was aware uh, of the reports that there was going to be an attack. There's a little bit of a nuance here from the book that I hadn't heard other places, that Stalin he did not think that Germany would actually going to attack. So he was colossally wrong in that. And I defy anyone to say how you can be so wrong and then get credit after. But he believed that he knew that there was a buildup, and he thought, well, Germany is doing a buildup just to kind of force me into giving them a better economic deal. You have to remember that. So the Soviet Union made World War II possible. Their alliance with Germany allowed for the second partition of Poland and the German invasion of Poland, and for Germany to focus on a war in the West, something that he likely would not have done without having at least a neutral Soviet Union in its back. And the treaty that they signed was very close to an alliance, certainly an economic alliance, because the Soviet Union was promising to give Germany whatever it needed in terms of resources. Now, they were driving a hard bargain. They were getting a lot of things in return, a lot of military equipment and technical expertise. But Stalin thought that this was basically just an attempt to kind of bargain a better deal, or an attempt to provoke him. There was an idea that, well, the Germans are positioning all their troops here with the hopes that there'll be some kind of border scuffle, and then Hitler will use that as a pretext for some kind of limited counterstrike. And so Stalin was actually ordering people to not provoke the Germans, to not fire back, to allow the flying of German reconnaissance planes, to allow patrols. And so this produced absolute paralysis. And the book ends before we get to Stalin's reaction after that. But it, in many ways, is kind of like a complete repudiation of Stalin's pre-war behavior. They go into a lot of detail also about the war in Finland. The war in Finland, the so-called Winter War, in the winter of 1940-41, or is it 39-40? Should know this, but anyway, the Red Army did abysmally terrible in that war. They eventually did achieve what they wanted. He actually goes into a lot of detail about that. So the Soviet Union, after fall of Poland, had partitioned half of Poland, or actually more than half. They had then occupied the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and then large parts of Romania and Hungary, area called Bessarabia and Bukovina. They basically just took, these are things that they had wanted for a long time, mostly areas that had formerly been Tsarist Russian territories. And through the alliance with Germany, they were able to kind of absorb all these territories. Well, because of a quirk of geography and of previous treaties, you have Russia's second largest city and main port, really, at least part of the year, is Leningrad, which is on a very small gulf. I think it's the Gulf of Finland, and on the other side of the gulf is obviously Finland, and then in the middle of the channel are several islands that are part of Finland. And what this basically meant is that any kind of military force on those islands could bottle up the entire Soviet Navy based in Leningrad. And so Stalin basically wanted these islands. He was asking not to own them outright, but to lease them. And these demands, although not reasonable really, were quite limited compared to the demands he placed on other states. We now actually, based on Kotkin's analysis, it seems likely that the Soviets didn't really want more than that. They honestly really did just want these islands. But from the Finns' point of view, this would only be a pretext to take more. They were convinced, not without reason, although perhaps incorrectly, that this would just be a prelude to greater and further Soviet acquisitions of Finnish territory. Finland had been part of the Tsarist Soviet Empire until the end of World War I, and so they steadfastly refused. And there's some interesting details about the negotiations between Molotov and the Finnish embassy, where he's like, how can you deny we're such a powerful state relative to you, and we're asking for so little. Why is this so difficult? And the Finns basically made it a point of pride and refused, and a war began. And the Finns slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Soviets in one of the biggest David versus Goliath matches ever. Now, eventually, the Soviet Union prevailed through sheer weight of numbers and material, but it was the conduct of the war was so embarrassing that it probably very much helped encourage Germany to invade, and demonstrated that the purges of the Soviet military had really ruined its fighting capacity. It really had, he'd hamstrung himself, Stalin, with his bloodlust. So it's definitely an interesting book. I found this part of this part of the biography much more readable, much more of a page turner. Uh, a lot of details about a lot of events that you kind of brush over in normal history, so you don't get all the details about, say, the occupation of Bessarabia, or the diplomatic shenanigans that went up to the leading to the war with Finland, uh, and the details of the Great Terror, how that played out, what Stalin was thinking during that, as best as we can tell. Obviously, there's a degree of speculation there, um, but yes, clearly. One of Kotkin's themes is that having despotic powers, having um, dictatorial powers, that's going to change someone, and probably not for the better. There's obviously that old aphorism that absolute power corrupts, or power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, he had absolute power, in ways, again, more than Hitler. To juxtapose this with Hitler, Hitler did not go and purge the Nazi Party. He did not go and kill a third of the Nazi Party, the Gauleiters, the people who were organizing in the beer halls or who were party members in various parts of state. He didn't go and kill his high-ranking people, Himmler and Goering, uh, and Ribbentrop and Keitel. These not Keitel, he was a general, but or Hess. He didn't go and liquidate all those people. He was loyal to all of them to the end of the war, essentially. Uh, even ones who were betraying him, like Admiral Cunaris, uh, he he tolerated them, sometimes forever, and in other cases until the very end of the war. This is so different from Stalin, where he was liquidating his own best allies, his own biggest supporters, his best friends, and the apparatus of his party. Um, and what would drive somebody to do something like that? You know, uh, is it? You don't want to say it's necessarily the logic of Marxism, but the logic of Marxism condones mass slaughter in such a way that it's not such a big moral leap for him to do this. You had to be a hard person. You had to do what was necessary. And many of the people who were aware of what he did said, these are virtues. We need somebody who has this iron will, who is willing to do the hard things. So people like Molotov will look at themselves and be like, do I have the gall, really, to order the murder of millions of people? And yet, that's what Marxist-Leninism demands, that you have entire classes of people that need to cease to exist. And unless you have some kind of way to do that, very gradually, peacefully, which it's hard to imagine how that would be done, it entails murdering them all. And Stalin not only had the will to do that, but by doing that, he kind of demonstrated that he was the man for the job, that he couldn't be replaced. And just to get ahead of where the book ends, there was a moment after the Germans invaded where he very easily could have been overthrown. That somebody could have said, "You have fucked up so badly. You were completely wrong in every way," and he could have been done away with. But there was nobody left in the Soviet Union who could think that way, or who could even venture thoughts like that. The only people who were left were people he had completely cowed and broken. Even the ones he hadn't killed, he'd imprisoned maybe their family, he maybe imprisoned them, he would maybe demote them. He'd kind of play with them. If you had the little perks of the party, he could pull those away just to let you know who was boss. And so he was the boss then. That's how they all treated him. It would be like something right out of The Walking Dead, where you just beat, degrade, humiliate, dominate somebody until they can't help but be your sycophant. And probably not until he was old, weak, and feeble did that grip ever release on people. So, fascinating book, excellent book if you're interested in the life of Stalin and the history of the Soviet Union during this period. There's so much emphasis on World War II that we kind of forget that there's a whole history that leads to that point. And these first two editions of the biography on Stalin do, I think, a really great job of illuminating that period to those who don't know too much about it, which I would include myself. So, all right, I will talk to you all later. Bye-bye.